All right, everyone, it is 6 o'clock, so I'm going to start us. So welcome. I'd like to call the October 11th, 2021 West Sacramento Environment Utilities Commission
Recording
meeting
in progress.
Pursuant to the Governor's Executive Order N2920, the members of the Environment Utilities Commission are and staff are meeting via teleconference to reduce the spread of COVID-19. Members of the public have been invited to watch the meeting via Wave Cable Channel 20 or streaming online at the city's website. All of the agenda and agenda item packets are available on the city's website for the Environment Utilities Commission. All public comments that were submitted by 5 p.m. to the clerk are available for consideration and are posted on the city website along with the agenda and links to the live streaming video. The commission clerk will note the commenters for each item, and the comments shall become part of the public meeting record. General administration function, part 1. Presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda within the jurisdiction of the commission. Ben, do we have any presentations?
We do not have any written comment. And I don't believe anybody's on the line to comment. If anybody wishes to comment, please speak up now so we can address the comment.
Okay, it sounds like we don't have any comments. Disclosure of ex parte communications. Any of the Environment Utilities Commission should disclose any communications they have had on the agenda items at this time. Have you had any communications? No? Okay, great. Consent agenda. So consideration of the approval of the minutes of the June 14th, 2021 Environment Utilities Commission. I hope everyone's reviewed the minutes. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes or any corrections?
I'll move to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
I'll second.
Right. So Commissioner Polino and Commissioner Petrie approved the minutes. Moved and seconded the minutes. Sorry.
Roll call vote.
Oh, roll call vote. Okay.
Commissioner Criswell?
Aye.
Commissioner Solario?
Aye.
Commissioner Green?
Aye.
Commissioner Petrie?
Aye.
Commissioner Chilano? Commissioner Blondo?
Aye.
Chair Cordano?
Aye. All right. And that brings us to our regular agenda. So first item on the regular agenda is the consideration of an update on planning and implementation efforts related to Senate Bill 1383, short-lived climate pollutants.
Yes, good evening, Chair Cordano and commissioners. The purpose of this item is to update you on our planning efforts and where we are today with preparing for implementing all of the requirements of SB 1383. And we're presenting our draft compliance program implementation plan and asking the commission to provide any feedback you may have on the plan. Gar Schultz from R3 Consulting Group, who you may remember from last meeting, is going to present tonight. And he's joined by Lisa Coelho, his colleague, and they're both available to answer questions at the end of his presentation. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gar.
Thank you so much, Paulina and commissioners. Nice to see you all again. Thank you for taking the time with this matter this evening. Our introductions have already been made, so we're just going to jump right into the presentation. May I have participant screen sharing, or if not, may Paulina put it up? It says it's disabled on my end. Almost there. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So as Paulina highlighted, this is an update to the presentation you originally heard from us in June, during which time we gave you kind of a forecast of the contents of the attached compliance and implementation plan. We've since finished work on that plan with the draft that's attached to your packet, and also have updated the financial resource gap and rate analyses, which were in rough draft form at the time that we presented to the Commission previously. Next slide, please. So this is what we'll cover today, very similar to what you heard from me a few months back. I will note here SB 1383 as a topic area, and as you probably gathered from the staff report and from the attached compliance plan, broad and detailed and lots of moving parts. So I am going to keep it to the 30,000-foot view in the presentation this evening. To the extent you have more detailed questions, I and Lisa will do our absolute most to answer those. Just note that I'm not going into every shred of detail in this presentation, just so that we have time to continue the meeting. Next slide, please. So by way of reminder and background for the Commission, SB 1383, which is a solid waste management law, but also a greenhouse gas emissions reduction law, takes effect January 1, 2022. It was originally adopted in 2016, and there were several years of rulemaking leading up to this new implementation date. And both in the city of West Sacramento as well as statewide, those compliance planning and implementation efforts are already underway. We're here tonight to seek your feedback on the various analyses that are included in the attached report. And then following this meeting, staff and R3 will be moving forward to council, importantly with the update to the city's municipal code to effectuate the mandatory enforceable requirements of SB 1383, but then also to bring the compliance plan as an informational item to council so that they're aware of the next steps the city will need to undertake. Next slide, please. A bit more on the details of this greenhouse gas reduction law. So it does support other policy objectives that the city has under the Climate Action Plan. It is a broad state law that is targeted at removing organics from landfills in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions due to methane, but then also has some other pretty important factors such as recovery of edible food and enforceable requirements for that, generating and kind of enforcing a circular economy with respect to driving demand for organic products or products made from organic waste materials. And it's not a diversion law in the sense that it's requiring certain amounts of, say, percentage diversion of organic. What it really says to local governments statewide is, thou shalt implement these types of programs and report on those on an annual basis, and those are covered here in the bullets. And much of what we have to share through the rest of the presentation is the detail on those various activities and the next step. Next slide, please. Okay, so broadly, and you've seen this slide before, there are around 6 categories of compliance activity, and each of these are detailed in somewhat more language in the following slides. But in essence, under SB 1383, City of West Sacramento and all other jurisdictions in the state need to provide a collection of organic services to all solid waste generators, whether residential or commercial. And organics defined broadly. This isn't just green waste or food waste. It includes paper, it includes food toilet paper and cardboard and a whole host of other types of materials. And so the expectation statewide is that everyone has access to and participates in those programs. And ultimately, and this gets to the very last hexagon on the bottom right side, agencies are empowered to enforce compliance with participation in those programs. There's high expectations for certain types of education and outreach to the community. I mentioned the procurement and edible food recovery requirements as well. And then there's a funding requirement for edible food capacity, which is also part of what we have to share this evening. Next slide, please. Okay, so now digging into some more of the specifics of what you find in the plan and is summarized in the staff report. I'll go through these relatively quickly. They also mirror what you've seen in the prior presentation, but it corresponds to some of those 6 categories that we've shown. So first off, and this is kind of the first initial lift for the city to undertake, as well as other jurisdictions statewide, is to essentially make it enforceable that you can and will enforce compliance with organics recovery by all generators in the city. So your current municipal code was compliant in a few different ways. We worked with staff and city council, the legal counsel to the city, to draft revisions to the municipal code to include the required provisions under SB 1383. Those are teed up and ready to go to council with November 3rd first reading, and then anticipated adoption on November 17th. And in essence, this is establishing edible food recovery requirements, establishing that generators must comply with the organic recycling provisions, and providing the enforceable mechanisms within the code itself. It's also integrated into the existing solid waste ordinance, and so it's very detailed and involved a bunch of analysis by Paulina and her staff, as well as the city's legal counsel and R3 during the course of the work. So that is teed up and ready to go, and that's the kind of the first milestone in achieving the city's compliance with SB 1383 prior to the end of the year. Next slide. Now, outside of establishing these expectations for solid waste generators, meaning those living or working in the city and generating waste materials, there's also a set of opportunities for the city to utilize its waste collection contractors to provide additional services. So first off, and this is an important finding, and it's one that not every city in the state can claim, is you're already providing the required organic service. So residents and businesses have access to both recycling that includes paper, and organic collection that includes yard trimmings and food scraps and the like. We already have a largely compliant collection program. There are some tweaks that will be needed to that program to establish further compliance over the course of coming years, including color-coded containers, black for landfill or garbage, blue for recycling, and green for organics. And the other aspects that the city may designate to the hauler, such as an inspection program and compliance, which we'll talk about a little bit later, namely that for the engagement with waste management in your haulers is to help get assistance from your haulers in monitoring contamination and providing the required types of outreach and education to your customers. So in terms of next steps, and these will be underway in the near future, the city will need to be in a position to negotiate certain outcomes with waste management, which will anticipated to unfold, I believe, starting later in this year and then take effect sometime in the following. And then also update the terms and conditions of the non-exclusive hauler system to include these SB 1383 requirements. And our team has already provided draft language to staff on that. So the next steps are essentially already have a pathway forward and are relatively concise in terms of what's needed. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Edible Food Recovery Program is a whole other beast, and I know you've heard about this a couple of different times now. So our findings to date is the city's done a great job of identifying the edible food generators, referred to as Tier 1 and Tier 2 generators in the community, corresponding to different sizes of business. The city has been participating in a county-wide project regarding the need to secure and fund additional capacity for edible food recovery. And that effort has been moving forward with, I believe, a report that's now out and available. That collaboration includes city funding of additional edible food capacity, which we'll get to in later slides. In essence, every edible food recovery generator within the city that meets the Tier 1 and Tier 2 definitions must have a written agreement to donate edible food to a food recovery organization. So in terms of next steps, simply the funding provided by the city for the additional capacity, and then also coordinating with the county via an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, to delegate the responsibility for certain types of inspections and outreach reporting. So those efforts have been, I think, well established already, and other than taking action on funding in the coming rate year, little remains to be done. Next slide. Thank you. Outreach and education, I mentioned a couple of different times. Both city and waste management provide outreach and education already, so it's just a matter of tweaking those to meet the expectations under the law. And then the Edible Food Recovery MOU that we just mentioned will also designate certain responsibilities to the company or to the county. again, here in next step, it's negotiating with waste management to make sure that they're providing the additional outreach that's required under the law and make tweaks for that in terms of the expectations. Not a huge lift. And the non-exclusive hauler terms and conditions drafts have already been provided, and it's a matter of effectuating those when the appropriate next time arises. Next slide, please. Okay, so inspections and enforcement, this is really where the rubber starts to hit the road in terms of the ordinance. And there's a couple of, and we discussed with the commission in the last presentation, a progressive enforcement strategy, not going out the gate in day one, starting to assess penalties to generators, but rather working on progressive education to generators in 2022, starting to ramp that up to be, kind of more noticed as a potential non-compliance in 2023. And then by 2024, the state does expect the city and everyone else in the state to start enforcing the mandatory provisions, meaning if you as a business or a resident are generating organic waste and aren't recycling it, then you'd be subject to minimum penalties that would be progressive and increasing over time. So in order to get to that end point, the city does need to arrange for inspection, meaning establishing who's generating waste within the community, who is subscribing to the required services, and then who is not. There's also a kind of separate effort to monitor compliance, which the city can engage waste management to do, but the actual kind of inspection of accounts, whether paper inspection, reviewing account records, or doing on-site reviews, is anticipated to be performed by city staff, which relates to a component of the funding assessment at the end of the presentation. And then in the end, once city staff has determined that someone is non-compliant with the regulations, and that will be referred over to court enforcement to assess the penalties as needed and as appropriate, and only starting in 2024, again, the ramp up period between now and then. So the next steps are identified here. I've mentioned the progressive enforcement a couple of times. We've already heard the exclusive hauler terms and conditions need to be revised for kind of a consistent theme throughout the next steps. And then in terms of reviewing options for monitoring contamination in the residential sector, hoping Lisa can actually fill me in on this because I'm spacing on the specifics of that next step. Can you fill me in, Lisa?
Yeah, so currently waste management's trucks are outfitted with cameras that can monitor contamination for the commercial and multifamily sectors, but that's not yet deployed in the residential sector. So another option is considering doing lid flip audits where somebody in person walks around, flips the lid of the container and observes if there's contamination present, until it could be possible in the future that waste management could install additional cameras. But the workaround in the meantime is a physical inspection.
Thank you, Lisa. And as a kind of a bit of additional information for the commission, that's not every container all the time. It's sampling of containers on a sampling of routes periodically. And we've done some math on that. It ends up being a fairly small proportion that becomes defensible in order to meet the expectations of the state and also remain representative of what's actually occurring in terms of contamination, meaning the wrong stuff in the wrong bin within the community. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the closing the loop portion of the law. So at the same time that the state is saying thou shalt recycle your organic, they're also saying to public agencies thou shalt purchase products made from organic waste products as well as recyclable paper. So ultimately, there's a target that's established based on population that the city needs to meet. That target can be achieved in a number of ways via procurement of compost, procurement of mulch, or procurement of energy derived from organic waste energy, essentially. The latter component really isn't accessible and available to the city right now, and really not to most agencies throughout the state. So at this point, it's anticipated that a portion of the procurement requirement is going to be fulfilled through compost and compost giveaway. We have to discuss some of those options with the commission, and your feedback was incorporated in these strategies as identified in the plan and here. So in terms of next steps, the city needs to secure an opportunity to get compost from Yolo County Landfill to provide for those giveaways, and then update its environmental purchasing policy with respect to the recyclable paper. Both of those efforts are queued up as next step city action. Next slide. Okay, and then if it wasn't enough, everything else, the city and everyone else has to keep extensive records relating to all these activities, and then provide reports on a periodic basis to CalRecycle. And in terms of next steps, it's securing some additional reporting information from Waste Management, the updated exclusive hauler permit. And then there are software packages out there which we've priced into the resource and rate analysis that can assist the city in this effort. And so there's an opportunity for the city to meet the record keeping and reporting requirements through a third-party software, and just simply need to issue an RFP and review proposals and make a selection around that. Next slide, please. Okay, so kind of getting towards the end game here, and this is where we'll see some new information for the commission, is that the city will incur costs associated with implementing SB 1383. Those costs broadly fit into the buckets identified on this slide, but more importantly, next slide, there's specific direct costs that are anticipated starting in 2022 and beyond. So to be clear, this isn't inclusive of all the costs of implementing the law. There are some possible costs that might be incurred by Waste Management that would get passed through to cities' ratepayers, and to the extent that those are identified. They haven't been identified yet. That's part of that negotiate with Waste Management next step. But these are city direct costs of implementing the various aspects that we've highlighted this evening. So in terms of the project management costs, that's additional outreach and education, doing the monitoring and inspection. So this is essentially a percentage of a full-time equivalent staff person. And again, these are broad level estimates at this point, really until the city begins its implementation. You won't know the exact costs in a variety of these areas, but this first next step, the first foray into funding those efforts. We just mentioned on the last slide the record keeping and reporting with a third-party software platform that can categorize the various record keeping requirements, monitoring contamination in the field in the way that Lisa described. The one number that is relatively firm at this point, as I understand it, and Paulina, correct me if I'm wrong on that, is the Edible Food Recovery Program share identified through the county's collaborative process. This is the city's specific portion of that additional, the anticipated additional edible food recovery capacity that's necessary countywide. And then the final one is our best estimate as to what it's going to cost for the city to begin to meet its procurement requirement for compost. This is not the entirety of that requirement, as it's broadly determined by our team and city staff that the entirety of it isn't really available yet in the marketplace, and what the city needs to do is to start to make those next steps towards meeting that procurement target. So this procures additional compost, but not all the way up to the target, as it's not known to be available or even possible to distribute throughout the community at that level. So all in, we're looking at around $450,000 a year of funding needed to support city's implementation of SB 1383. And again, before other costs that might be attributed to the contract and franchise agreement with these, which have not yet been identified. Next slide, please. So to translate that into what does that look like for the ratepayer, we've presented two tables. This first one is that $450,000 less the amount for edible food recovery, because it's a policy decision for the city, and perhaps even informed by some legal decisions yet to be made as to whether you would seek to include edible food recovery capacity funding into your rate base or not. So this first slide shows what that looks like without the edible food recovery capacity being included. That's around $175,000 a year. And then there's a second determination, which is they collect that from only Waste Management, which is the lower row, or do you collect it on Waste Management customers as well as the permitted hauler customers? So there's a couple policy choices that can be made. Ultimately, it's anticipated the city will make that as the city moves forward with a rate setting study in early 2022 for rates effective July 1, 2022. But this gives you the broad parameters of what the rate impact would look like on $175,000 a year. So if you include the permitted haulers, it's just over 1%, and you can see ranging from under a quarter per resident per month on the smallest container size to under 40 cents a month on the larger container size, and the respective outcomes for commercial and multifamily dwellings. That's per cubic yard, mind you, so that would be additive to the number of times a commercial or multifamily resident or business owner would get their materials collected. And then if it's not including permitted haulers, you're looking at 1.5% the outcome shown. Next slide, please. So if it was funded, if you were to seek to fund the whole amount as the city, these are the range of impacts that would be seen with and without the funding being captured from the customers from permitted haulers or just on the waste customers. So ranging from 2.75 to just under 3.9% in the associated impacts here. So hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of scale and perspective with what we're talking about. It is, I think, broadly known and anticipated here in the city of West Sacramento and in other cities that you do, one, have the ability under SB 1383 to assess fees to recover your cost of compliance. It is an unfunded mandate, and the law specifically recognizes that it is an unfunded mandate. As an agency, you may set fees in order to recover those costs. But it's also going to be a bit of a shifting target as compliance ramps up over the course of the coming couple of years. And so this is that first pass at what it would look like for you going out the gate in 2022. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you for letting me talk to you for so long. Happy to take your questions and provide what answers we can, seek your feedback on the compliance plan, and then ultimately we and staff are anticipating to finalize this, present it to council, and then move forward also on a similar time frame with the SB 1383 ordinance adoption process, which will be undertaken shortly. Thank you for the time. I think you can pull the slide deck down now unless commissioners have specific questions relating to the slide.
Commissioner Criswell will let you go first. I'm sorry for my baby in the background.
All right. Okay, a couple questions regarding cost. The first one is what makes the edible food recovery cost so high? It's just way more expensive than all the other stuff. And then kind of maybe related to that, but how much is cost expected to go down over time as kind of the landscape changes kind of over the next several years? How would that look? Or as far as
the edible food recovery costs or the kind of general costs overall?
I would say overall for the kind of the projections of maybe as people start to reduce their waste, as you want them to, maybe that makes the cost go down. And then later on, as you start to collect penalties, maybe that actually offsets the cost. But I guess first it was the question around how come the edible food recovery part is so disproportionately expensive?
Yeah, and that's subject to the county-wide capacity planning, additional capacity planning process, which I think either Paulina or Lisa, you may be more prepared to speak to than I. It is done, outside of the city, and it's a broad assessment of what's going to be needed countywide in order to meet the additional capacity. The county does have a responsibility. The law, essentially calls out county responsibilities to determine what additional amounts of edible food recovery capacity are needed. And this is the result of their study, indicating, the broad amounts of funding that are included in their study and the percentage share or dollar share by agency within the county overall. Paulina, anything more to add?
Yeah, so the edible food recovery estimates are based on edible food recovery organization needs. And so when the county team interviewed all of the edible food recovery organizations in the county, they assessed what they would need in order to take or to process the edible food from these commercial generators that don't already have a program in place. That's where that additional capacity terminology comes into play. If they already have a program, then we don't necessarily have to fund their program, but if there's a need for these organizations to get new equipment, refrigerated trucks, or a warehouse space, or anything, you could think about the logistics of getting edible food from a generator to people in need. there's a lot of moving parts. And so that's where that figure comes from, is trying to get a lot of these organizations up to speed, get them the equipment they need. They're going to have scales that some of them don't have. They have to track all of the tonnage and then report that back. You know, we hope that once a lot of that initial capital investment is made, that those costs may decrease, but that initial estimate is only for tier 1 generators. So those businesses like the grocers and the distribution centers. There's another level of edible food recovery generators that comes into play in 2024, the tier 2 generators, and that's, you know, not really field. What is it called now? Sutter Health Field. You know, they have edible food that they have that's pre-cooked, and we have to figure out how to manage that and get that out to the community. There will be an additional cost associated with that, which is sort of an unknown right now. Hope that explains a little bit about why it's so expensive. I mean, a lot of the other expenses for the programs that we have now they've already been spent, right? Waste management already has trucks. They already collect organics. So for us to add food waste to that didn't really have a huge increased expense, whereas edible food is a whole new program, and we're funding a lot of businesses to get them up to speed to be able to accept material. And there's a lot of upfront costs on that. So if I did, hopefully that answers your question. I can follow up if you have more questions.
I think that describes it pretty well. Answers it for me. Thank you.
And I will say that amount is actually less than we were originally getting estimates from. Some organizations were giving us estimates that were a lot more than that. So I was happy that our portion was under $300,000.
And I guess that kind of ties into the second part of the question on the costs ongoing, because obviously some of that would be ongoing costs, but then some would be initial cost that goes away because you spent it already. But then, you know, the second part around this program, the cost burden on the businesses, does that tend to go down over time, or is it steady, or what do we think about that?
I think it's too early to say. I mean, of the other categories that were shown in that resource gap analysis slide, some of those are just going to be ongoing activities that the cities in other jurisdictions in the state are going to be required to undertake year after year after year: inspection, contamination monitoring, education and outreach, enforcement. Those may not, in fact, decrease over time. They could theoretically increase as you reach, 2024 time period and are actually getting more into the enforcement space, and depending on how well folks are applying out there. So I think, with respect to the fact that they are ongoing implementation activities that aren't really associated with folks' achievement of better diversion or better capturing of organic materials, these are just part of the routine aspect of demonstrating to CalRecycle that you're doing the required minimum set of activities, which are not based so much on how well the community is doing, just you actually having to proceed through them. Now, all that said, what I think the market in our broad industry anticipates there will be some better, more refined solutions that come along, but it's not like there's some turnkey third-party contractor that has a good approach or product to handle all of this all at once on a broad regional scale. So as you kind of see from that chart, if we're saying, well, we anticipate there's going to be some need for staff time, there's going to be some need for in the field staff activity, there's going to be greater amounts of outreach and education. And theoretically, those could see greater economies of scale as this gets into full-born implementation. But the opposite is also true in the sense that these estimates could be short of what's actually required in terms of those time and investment from city staff. And some of that will also be dependent on what does CalRecycle find as the city starts reporting its results and its outcomes over the course of the coming year plus. So I think our hope and intent here is to present something that's realistic. I don't think that we're going to see, say within the course of a few years, a doubling of this number. But I also don't think that the commission and the city should have the expectation that it's going to be reduced down to zero once the program is fully implemented, because there are ongoing implementation efforts that are required year over year, regardless of how well the community is doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Blondo.
Thank you. A couple of recommendations. So given the discussion previously, I would recommend a table on what you guys have identified, maybe a 5-year a cost analysis that says year one is going to be the most one-time cost, and then here's the annual with your assumptions of increasing um, rates. That would be good to see from the larger perspective on the long-term funding needs. Another recommendation I have, you have on page 5, on your report, the recommendation for multifamily generator. You identified 14 days of notice. Just notify them on day one. You give them the keys, you give them the brochure, because they're generating trash right away. Don't wait 14 days. And in that same sense for residential, single family residential, my recommendation is if you guys are, if they have the kitchen counter waste recycle thing, have it an opt-out option. Just start giving them to people. If it really is mandatory, that's a good reminder. Hey, you need to put stuff in here to put in the waste. And it's an opt-out instead if somebody already has whatever they have and they don't want it. The major suggestion I have on table 5, page 29, your estimated staffing cost. As I looked through that, at first when I just looked through the table, I was like, something doesn't make sense. Of course, the totals don't add up, and the mind tends to want to total up, right? So you've got 579 hours at 60 hours, $60 an hour, and you're listing 69.48. That doesn't make sense. So I read through the document and said, yeah, the estimates is much higher. If part of this is because there's an assumption there's current staffing that'll cover it, I would exclude that, because what you're doing is cannibalizing from other activities that should already have been funded to do something else. This is the cost of the program. Either that or put another column that says, here's the discounted amount that you're assuming to reduce the cost, because that is the total. I would think you reflect the entire cost that we're facing, the added cost for the program. Then you could subtract out the assumptions of, here's how we could fund some things already. Then that's clear. This is going to cost us X number, and that means the staff somebody's going to spend time less over somewhere else and do this instead. Even if it's just a fraction of their time, fraction of hours, that's still important, because I would imagine they already had jobs to do. I have other things, but I'll wait until everybody else gets a chance.
Thank you for those. And then the first few are noted. I know Lisa's taking good notes on all of them. With respect to table 5, one clarification is that those are anticipated for rollout over the course of a 5-year period. So that's kind of the amortized 5-year amount, if I understand it correctly. Lisa, maybe you can explain this in a little bit better detail than I.
Yeah, I can explain. There's some assumptions that are described in the narrative, but not necessarily clear in the table, and I apologize for that. But the thought was to estimate reaching, for example, every business and multifamily complex, but over a 5-year period. So rotating through a certain number of businesses and multifamilies every year, so that eventually by 2025, everybody would have been provided additional assistance or assisted with enforcement or contamination or something unusual, but as just a way to kind of benchmark the hours and not assume that every business or multifamily would be visited immediately next year. We can make that.
Right, and maybe that to the first suggestion, it says maybe create that 5-year view instead. But the table is confusing because it goes to annual hours in the one column, and then and somewhere there's a math that's I'm being forced in my head to say.
Points well taken. Just wanted to provide some additional context. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. I just want to remind the commissioners that, we have another report tonight. So if you have a lot of comments, let's lump them together to make sure that we have time for our other presenters. Because I know this is a really interesting subject and we went really long last time. So I want to make sure that we have time for both our presenters tonight and to give them questions too. Commissioner Solorio.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to say first that Garth, that was a really crisp and succinct presentation. I think we all appreciate it for its clarity in general and just getting right to it and laying it out very nicely. I do have several questions, but I won't go too long. Maybe we could possibly get some answers after by submitting them to Paulina so that we can
Yep,
handle
we'd be
this
happy
meeting.
we'd be happy to do that. Yep.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Commissioner Solorio.
Just
I
a
would
couple.
go ahead and just say all your questions now because others might have the questions. So
Okay.
I think it's okay.
So am we to understand that regarding the capacity issue that it is the onus is on the city to basically provide a place for the edible food to go to be used in order for it to count as being diverted?
Really what it is that the onus on the city is to fund the amount of additional capacity that's needed as generators who are not currently donating their food come online. So it's really at the funding requirement to fund the additional capacity that's been identified on a countywide level. And it's not so much about counting as diverted as to ensure that every edible food recovery or edible food generator that is covered by the law can enter into an agreement or some sort of written instrument with a provider and get their edible food donated.
Okay, it has somewhere to go, right?
Correct.
And then let's see the other permitted haulers that are not the FA, I think it's called. Who do they serve, and why would the city not collect from them?
That's a good question. So they do serve city commercial customers. So Waste Management exclusive franchise agreement provides for the garbage collection from commercial customers. But then other non-exclusive permitted haulers can provide for the organic and or recycling services. And so they do serve customers throughout the city. They do under permit with the city and provide regular reports to the city overall. So, and then they also may serve outside the city, of course. It's good. Typically the case with, that type of a program is they're providing plenty of services elsewhere, but then they also do provide services within the city, just not a part of the exclusive franchise agreement that the city holds with Waste Management. And as to why you might not collect from them, it is a different kind of fee setting mechanism. So whereas with the waste management customers where the city does the billing, it's a relatively turnkey approach to introduce the SB 1383 fee into the rate overall. Whereas doing it with the permitted haulers would require separately setting a different fee that's applicable to them and then receiving that fee as a part of their reports, along with other fees that they currently pay to the city. So it's really just a kind of a measure of mechanics ultimately in the ability to administer the fees to both sets. I think if it were me in the city's shoes, I would seek to collect it from all of the waste haulers. And with the knowledge that they do end up passing that along to their ratepayers or customers.
So probably just a matter of implementation, but is that, I'm sorry, I don't recall, is that a recommendation of the report, R3's report, that the city does pursue that?
It isn't cast in those terms as much as to say, here are your options moving forward, partially because we're not the agents moving forward with your rate and fee study in a new year. And so knowing that there's separate policy decisions still to be made, we just wanted to lay out the playing field, the commission and then the council and the city kind of understand the impact that could be associated with those decisions.
Okay. Right.
If you were to press me on a recommendation, I would say, yes, I do think you should collect it from them.
Thank you. And one last small thing regarding the compost and the city giving that away. Is the city currently doing that? I thought that they do that to an extent, but obviously in the future it would really ramp up. But is that something that WESAC is currently doing?
I don't believe so, Paulina. My memories.
We haven't done any compost giveaways in West Sacramento. We have done a few mulch giveaways a few years ago. The county did a free giveaway at the landfill of compost recently to all county residents. And ultimately, what we will do is have compost giveaways in West Sacramento. Details of where and how often and all that will need to be ironed out. But yeah, we haven't actually there wasn't compost available locally until very recently when the county's facilities started to produce compost.
The mulch,
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
The mulch giveaways would be part of this effort, though, as well, right?
It could be, but yeah, as Brock was saying, one of the compliance methods for the procurement side of the regulations is to put all our eggs in one basket and buy compost for giveaways. But we could do a combination of compost and mulch. We also, as a city, use those products, so part of the procurement will be for our own uses in our parks and our facilities. Yeah, absolutely, we can explore that. At this point, the agreement that I'm working on with the county addresses compost, and we can get mulch from other areas. Like I think in the past we actually had tree trimmers drop the mulch off directly to us. So we have other options for procuring that product outside of the county's agreement.
Thank you.
Right. Commissioner Chilino?
Thank you. So around the procurement as well, it says that the report says that the city is talking with the landfill about getting deliveries of up to 600 cubic yards of compost per month. And in my reading of, I think it's table 3, if the city was actually maxing out that delivery from the landfill, that would seem to satisfy the current requirement based on the population. I know it's going to be updated with the census data. So is that full potential allocation not available if the city wanted to actually get it, as you might have mentioned, Garth?
That's my sense of it. I'm not in the table in those discussions, and I think that Paulina, the reason it was structured up to that amount was to seek to be able to secure the full amount, but with the knowledge that every compost facility that's out there is being approached with the same question and simply don't have the supply to fulfill that demand yet. Paulina, anything more to add?
Yeah, the other part of that in our negotiating we're working with the county to come to an agreement. It's not just the procurement in this agreement. It's actually for us to secure capacity at the landfill for processing our organic waste. So it's a flow agreement. Part of that is the compost procurement. We added that in there as a way for us to meet the SB 1383 compliance. One of the other components to that is that the county is contracting with Northern Recycling, and they can only get so much compost out of the contract. So that's why it's an up to, and we're trying to get the best we can out of the agreement to help us meet these requirements. But it is likely we may have to purchase more and only get so much free. There's some different, configurations that we're looking at. The part that I find challenging is that it seems pretty clean to use compost as our way of meeting the procurement requirements, but that's a lot of compost, and I don't even know if we'd have to be creative in finding ways to use all of that among our residents, our own uses, and other landowners in the city.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification.
Commissioner Blondo, did you get all your questions answered?
For the sake of time, my only question is how would we submit our other recommendations and questions for the record?
We have time. I mean, if you have some, we have time. I was just suggesting that we lump all of our questions together so we're not doing this back and forth, so that saves a little bit of time that way. So if you have more questions, please feel free to ask them.
Okay. It's a list. So page 11, you mentioned using county inspectors. Just wondering on the accountability, if it's county inspectors, is if there's an issue, and if we outsource that to the county, who's responsible? Is it still the city or is it the county, whoever failed their job?
I'll take that one, Garth, since that's related to so that's specific to the edible food recovery portion only. And so the environmental health department at the county already inspects these generators for food safety requirements. So there's an efficiency of scale of having them do that for us. And we are going to execute an MOU with the county to include that work and some other things. So we will have an agreement with an understanding of what our expectation is and what we get for the services. The nice thing is they're not proposing to charge us anything for the edible food recovery inspection, since they're already out there anyway. So it just made the most sense to continue utilizing existing inspection staff for that purpose. But that's edible food only. The inspections for the organics recycling businesses, that will lie with city staff.
Table 2 on that same page, just wondering if there should be larger, because I would think there's more restaurants in town. Just wondering.
You're talking about for tier 2?
Table 2, tier 2, yeah.
Yeah, so the tier 2 generators are they have to have over 200, I think it's 250 seats. There actually aren't a lot of restaurants in West Sacramento that meet the criteria.
Okay. And that's the same for tier 1 generators as well. So a lot of restaurants may not.
Well, restaurants aren't considered tier 1 generators. I'm sorry, I wasn't. Where are you exactly in the report? Or
I was just looking at the page 10 and 11 on table 1 and 2, the food generators, and I'm just thinking for West Sac there should be a larger list. I'm thinking, hey, there's other restaurants I know I visited and partook with, and I don't know if they're just excluded or it's just this is a abbreviated list.
Just a high level list in accordance with the definition of each of those generator types under the law. And so it's only sorry, my screen is like cycling back and forth in ways I don't know why. So it's just meeting the definitions of what the tier 1 and tier 2 generators are. It's not inclusive of all restaurants or all commercial food establishments. So it is an abbreviated list in accordance with the guidelines around what those generator pools are supposed to be.
And then page 20, table 3, and that was the discussion on things the city must buy. And I think I saw where there's the table 3 indicated, I can't find it now, other types of things to get, such as electricity or transportation fuel. Is that a consideration, or are you suggesting we just do it all in this compost? Because I'm sure the city consumes electricity and has or fuel.
Yeah, the issue is that it's got to be electricity or fuel that is produced from organic waste product, of which there is very little occurring statewide and none really within your immediate market reach. So it would be, a lovely way of meeting the requirement in the future. And, the only clients that I've spoken to that have that ability are just coincidentally, 1, run their own utility, and 2, are co-located next to a facility that is already producing electricity using organic waste material. So it is just a very small pool of available sources at this point.
But in the future, it could switch to that if it's a difficulty just getting the mulch or the compost.
Certainly. I mean, those opportunities you kind of have the fulfilling the target is a strategy that can be adapted and changed over time on an annual basis. And then it can be any mix of those as those become available.
Right. And for the implementation, attachment 2 has a set of dates. Some of them already passed. I know that's a draft, but is that to be updated once the city council approves your plan, or some things already happened?
Lisa, can you take this one?
Yes. Good news, some things have already happened. And this is like a working implementation plan where we periodically update and change that so we can add additional things that have been completed. Some things have started prior to this report and remain in progress. So it's something where we're continually, adapting the dates to turn them over to.
And the last one's just a recommendation. Or a question. Are we working with the Chamber of Commerce or any other group in terms of communication? I didn't notice that, but it might be in there already somewhere.
Absolutely. I don't know that we addressed that in this plan, but we have been, my staff person, Susan Strand, has been presenting to the Chamber over this past year. We've done, at least 2, if not 3 presentations on different aspects of SB 1383 and working with them directly to do outreach and education to the business community.
Great. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. I have one comment, and it's just about messaging to residences. And that is when we talk about contamination, you need to be, and I'm just, as somebody who deals in environmental contamination on a daily basis, that's what's highly publicized and that's what people think of. And so when you say contamination, I don't think people are going to understand what you're talking about. So it might be good once you're doing messaging to the public that you're talking about, like, putting the wrong things in the wrong bins. And so, you know, and maybe remove that word, like, or have it as a subset. So that that's not the thing people focus on. Cause I think you're going to get a lot of mixed messaging from that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Point well taken, Chair. You know, it's the language that CalRecycle uses in SB 1383 and also continues to use in other kind of exploration of recycling topics. Certainly the message to, you know, to residents and businesses is really, here's what goes in the right bin, and here's the list of non-acceptable items. And any communication coming from the city or from a hauler is going to say, you had these non-acceptable items in this bin. You need to correct for that. These items go in this bin. And it really is just, it's literally just comparing, hey, what is acceptable in each of the containers? And yes, I agree. Contamination as a term for that for consumers is not very helpful.
It's a hard one because it's so highly publicized that, you know, even though it means one thing, people only think of it in one area. So, yeah. So
cross-contamination is a little softer.
Yeah.
Well, and even that, you know.
Yeah.
Well, they're like, I didn't put paint in there. It's not contaminated. Yeah.
Okay, Commissioner Florio.
Yeah, I'm feeling a little overly conscious about my apparent like fascination with compost and mulch. But Paulina, who do I contact? What's the right city office or department that actually, where I could get information online, like if these things are going to happen, if there's going to be any kind of organized, you know, giveaways, and, you know, I shouldn't feel too bad about it because, hey, this increases capacity, right? So who are the offices that would be running these things that I could?
Are you talking about the giveaways specifically? Like
yeah, compost and mulch.
Well, they'll be coordinated by my division.
Okay.
It probably in conjunction with Public Works and/or Parks.
Yeah. So I could see that on the website.
Yeah, I mean, and we would, when we do our outreach in my division, we utilize the city emails, our social media pages, the website. We have utility bill inserts. We try to promote those types of things through a lot of different avenues. So,
okay,
I would anticipate that those won't happen right as effective January 1st. So I would think maybe latter part of the year, or even it could possibly be early 2023 before we have a really robust giveaway program. And that's one of the hard things right now is establishing all those things and getting them in place.
So even though we have an organics diversion program now, right, we don't implement any regular mulch giveaways. I heard you say that it has happened in the past, but this is not like a regular thing.
Right. We had mulch giveaways as part of another larger regional program called Mulch Madness. There was a lot of logistics, and at the time we didn't have the resources to manage those programs on a regular basis, so they were very periodic, and then it got to the point where it became too challenging to do that. So those are things that we need to work through, is the logistics of staffing these events, having a location that works for not only the city staff and their normal operations and business, and the residents gaining access to that.
Do you know what the source for that was?
Well, one of the, I think we received some mulch directly from a local tree company that the city had contracted with. So it was kind of like, I think they call it arborist mulch, which is not the mulch that most residents want. It's the better mulch when it comes to using mulch for organic composting from a gardening perspective. And at other time, we actually had to purchase the mulch. Wow. It's been several years, so I don't recall exactly.
Thank you, Paulina.
All right. Do we have any final questions? No? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for your presentation and look forward to seeing the next draft.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I believe the next draft will be, as it's approved, goes up to City Council. We'll certainly take the comments and recommendations and suggestions here and make appropriate revisions. And a number of these were things that we certainly can seek to reflect in the next draft, but then it'll be going forward to council along with the SB 1383 compliant ordinance. So then, thank you so much for the time. We really appreciate it, and look forward on completing this process with Paulina and her staff here shortly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Garth and
Great
Lisa.
presentation.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to move on to our next regular agenda item, which is the presentation on fundamental findings of the Urban Water Management Plan.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Ariana Adami. I'm the new director for capital projects, and I wanted to stop by. Luckily, I'm not the one doing the presentation. I have subject matter experts here who are going to be doing the presentation, but I wanted to stop by and say hello and introduce myself. I started with the city a couple of months ago, and so this is the first time I believe that our department has had to present on a topic. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to just say hello, put a name to a face so you all are aware that I'm here. But I want to pass this off to our supervising civil engineer, Vin Kay, to make introductions and to conduct the presentation. So thank you.
Absolutely. Hi, all. I'm Ben. I think I presented at the EU a while back, but I'm familiar with some of the commissioners, but it's probably been a while. Actually, I'm going to introduce Amber Wallace, our senior engineer. She is the project manager of the Urban Water Management Plan update, and then she will also introduce our consultant team. And I will be here to assist with any question and answers at the end or along the during the presentation. Okay, Amber?
Thank you, Vin and Director Adami. I'm Amber Wallace. Welcome to our presentation. I am here with our consultant, Tully and Young, Gwenmore Tully and Greg Young, who will be giving the presentation for the Urban Water Management Plan. And I'll also be available for comments afterwards. Questions. So I'd like to introduce Gwenmore Tully.
Hey, thank you very much, Amber and everyone, Chair Cordano and members of the commission. Thanks for letting us come to you tonight. My name is Gwenmore Tully with Tully and Young. My business partner is also with me, Greg Young. And we were hired by the city to prepare the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan. Our company does comprehensive water planning throughout the state of California and the Pacific Southwest, working at the federal, state, regional, local, and private entity levels. And we've been very fortunate to work with the staff at the city. Everybody is just phenomenal. So that's a plug to them because they are. So tonight we're going to talk about the Urban Water Management Plan preliminary findings. And just as a little background on it, the Urban Water Management Planning Act is Water Code Section 10610. And that provision requires urban purveyors with 3,000 connections to prepare every 5 years an urban water management plan. And we are in the process of preparing that for the city right now. And tonight we're going to present our preliminary finding. Next slide, please. Or maybe put up the presentation. How about start with that? That'd be good. Okay. You can go to slide 2, please. Thank you. So the fundamentals of the Urban Water Management Plan essentially requires this customer demands to be met under various supply conditions. And go ahead and push the button. Essentially, it's a very simple equation. And it seems really simple, but it's really very complicated, where your supply as compared to your demand essentially produces what your water supply reliability is. You have reliable supplies under various conditions in various year types. Next slide. And the Act this year has additional items that have been added, and I anticipate in the future will continue to be added. So you need to do a 20+ year analysis under the water code. We expand that to 25 years because it's more aligns with other urban planning land use actions that cities do. There's a 5-year drought analysis this year. We have to look at 5 consecutive dry years. There's an annual analysis that'll be coming up in July of 2022 that we're preparing for. And then a refined water shortage plan. If you remember the drought from 2015, there were significant issues. The governor had made some declarations about drought, and there was a little confusion about implementation of drought plans. And so the water shortage plan provisions in the law were changed to accommodate some of those questions. Next slide. So I think the fundamental piece of this is the Urban Water Management Plan is the city's water planning document. Yes, it's a legislative mandate, but it is an effort by the city to essentially look fresh at demands and supplies to understand what's going on. And as conditions change within the city, it grows, it changes land uses in certain ways, new things become apparent. And so we look at the city's service reliability and we consider the city's unique circumstance, right? What are the historic circumstances? How do we even get to where we are? How did the city get its water rights in the way it wanted to get them? What's anticipated? What are the growth patterns within the city? What are land use plans looking like? And then trends. What are we seeing in terms of demographics and other things that are happening within the city? And how does that play into water planning itself? We integrate some of those fundamental things within the city with regional planning acts. So the Regional Water Authority, which is a group of entities within the American River watershed basin, essentially, and includes the city of West Sacramento, does planning actions and takes steps and works on drought planning, as well as other things like the YOLO Subbasin Groundwater Agency, right? The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is a new item in play, and it requires us to be thinking about groundwater conditions and surface water conditions in the context of that plan. So we are working to integrate the local planning items with regional planning action. And then finally, we need to fundamentally meet the legislature's urban water management plan statutory criteria. And some of those are essentially to help guide the planning, but others of them are so that the legislature can roll up, or the regulatory agencies can roll up findings among numerous water plans and make presentations to the legislature about those findings. Next slide. So here are kind of some of the fundamental findings. Projected demands are increasing. The 2020 demands within the city are about 11,700 acre feet. 2045 projected demands, about 20,400, so close to double, looking in the future in a 25-year planning horizon. Per capita water demands are decreasing, which we met a statutory criteria there, the 20 by 2020 obligation. But that's a good thing. That means that people are using less water. They're conserving more water. And so your current use is 192 gallons per capita per day. Your target use based on this mandate was 234. So you've met your statutory obligation. And we think the trend within the city is to continue future conservation and less water use per person. Next slide. We looked at the fundamental water supplies, and we see there are reliable water supplies in a 5-year drought. We'll talk about those in a little more detail. But these supplies require active management, and the staff of the city is fully aware of the complexity of these water rights and how to manage them, and spends a lot of time focusing and thinking about how to move them or deal with them on each year. And then importantly, in dry years like this one, monthly supply management is important. What water supplies and what water assets are available under various conditions, and that is part of the management strategy that the city staff worked on. And then short-term actions to augment reliability outlook. There are other things that can happen within the city to help augment reliability, and that can be on the supply side or the demand side. We're also finding, based on the city's water asset portfolio, its supplies reliable through the 2045 planning horizon. And I want to add into this, we consider things like climate change and differences in the way water supplies move in the regulatory and hydrologic environments to help determine these reliability considerations. But other things that need to happen, we need to expand the system capacity. That just is something to deal with growth, obviously. and then improve system redundancy. Make sure we have backup supplies and things like this to in the event of catastrophic outage or other. Next slide, please. This is a general slide showing the forecasted water use from 2025 through 2045, just broken out by some category. And I know it's a little confusing here. On the left side, you see existing, those are the existing houses and things that are in play. And then there's a new customer class, which is essentially things to be built and coming in the future. I want to draw your attention to the line that says cannabis. This is a developing thing throughout the state of California, and what demands and water supplies will be used to meet those demands as they grow as a land use planning item within various jurisdictions. But you can essentially see the total system demand, if you get to the bottom line, 14,600 by 2025, getting to 20,400 by 2045. Next slide. City water supplies. The city has sort of three fundamental surface water supplies: a state water resources control board appropriative water right permit, a Central Valley project contract supply that actually incorporates the permit as well, and then a North Delta Water Agency contract, which is very unique in the state of California. Annual normal year water supplies approximate 36,000 acre feet of water. That's a lot of water when your demands are obviously not that high, and dryer supplies approximate about 23,900. Importantly, and this is what we talk about, the city has monthly supply limitations in critically dry years, and we deal with those in a management perspective with the city staff. And then also dryer supply is based upon a percentage of normal year water use. It almost seems counterintuitive in some way. You have to use more in order to have more dry year supply. And we can explain that some more as well. Next slide, please. We like to use a very complex spreadsheet, and this is just a piece of it here, just so you can understand where we go with this. We break down supplies on a monthly basis, and we actually, I'll call it game the supplies in some way. Use this as a model to see how different supplies can move back and forth within the city and how they can be used in different ways under different scenarios. So this worksheet sort of lays out how we get to the fundamental total supplies at the end of a year. Next slide. There are key issues with the supplies and actions that we need to look at for augmentation in the future. Annual and monthly supply limitations with each water asset. So each water asset has a set of rules that apply to it, and we help break down those rules for purposes of water supply planning. We created a 5 consecutive dry year scenario based on these monthly analyses. We think we recognize the need to develop groundwater supplies. For those of you who know the city's history, it was at one time only groundwater and moved to surface water in the 1980s based on just better supplies and water quality issues and things like this. High mineralization, essentially, of groundwater. And then other supply management questions. Water rights curtailment, meaning certain water rights may be cut off more frequently in the past during certain months. We have to focus on May through October during critically dry periods like we're in this year. And then improve the use of Central Valley project contract supply in normal years. Next slide. But when we look at the supplies cumulatively, we take them over a broader horizon or over a yearly pattern, you can see there's significant supplies. In the future, your supplies actually grow over time, and it's hard to explain how that happens, but based on the way your contracts work and how they can meet certain demands within the city. But we can see that on an annual basis, we're seeing significant surpluses in supply, right? But we have to break those down. When we break them down on a monthly basis, there are times when supply actually equals the demand. So you might have significant surpluses of supply in November and December, or January, February, March, but during other periods of the year, it can be a little tighter. Next slide. One of the new or updated requirements we talked about at the outset here is the water shortage contingency plan. And this ties to Article 9 of Chapter 13.04 of the city's municipal code. And specifically, it ties to 13.04, I think 0.830, which essentially references in times of shortage the urban water management plan as the document that helps the city implement its shortage provisions and manage shortage. And these can happen not just by a shortage essentially from the water supplies themselves, but for example, in 2015, the governor's declaration requiring everybody to conserve 20% across the state, the city then has to take steps to follow that lead and implement shortage plans. So the water shortage plan tiers from the code. It has mechanisms to reduce demand, stages of implementation. The act this year requires 6 stages. So up to 10%, up to 20%, et cetera, until you get to 50% and then over 50%. So thinking about catastrophic outages, earthquakes, other things like this, and how to manage for those. And then what your communication plan is as a city. How are you going to inform customers and the public about moving into stages of implementation? And then last, increasing supply. We're talking about increasing groundwater production within the city to help create redundancy, and then other water connections potentially with neighboring water agencies. So those are long-term, big picture planning items that we're considering in this urban water management plan. Next slide. So this is essentially our timeline and where we are. We had a kickoff meeting in June. We've been developing draft chapters from July through October. Tully Young is presenting tonight, obviously, to the Environment and Utilities Commission. And then public review draft will be out November 2nd, and the City Council will hold a public hearing on the public review draft on November 17th. So we are in a sort of a rapid fire mode right now of finalizing our chapters, getting them into a position that we can feel comfortable getting the public review draft and then moving into the public hearing. But what you've heard tonight is essentially the fundamental findings that will be incorporated into that draft document. So next slide. And with that, I think we're open for any questions, comments, concerns, whatever there might be.
Commissioner Criswell, please.
Yes, hello. There was something on there a second ago about increased groundwater production. Does that literally just mean pull more out of the ground, like well water pumps kind of thing, or what? And in relation to that, how does that relate to the aquifer on the water table levels? Are those going down, or is there some kind of unsustainable thing that's going on there as well, or is that not so much a factor?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot embedded in that question. So the YOLO Groundwater Sustainability Agency is a new entity that covers essentially the entire YOLO subbasin, okay? And this entity, under a new law called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, was formed to manage this basin to meet sustainability criteria mandated under law. So that's sort of a starting point background. The city is working within that group to make sure that any use of groundwater or augmentation of groundwater, that it is preserved under its historical rights. Again, it was only on groundwater prior to 1986, are still available for the city's use. And in that context, ensuring that the long-term sustainability of the Yellow Basin is preserved. So I'm hoping that answers that question. It is a regional effort tied to a city effort, which will be tied to specific groundwater wells to be used to meet supply needs.
So, and that actually mostly answers that. Just I kind of wonder, is there certain things around that we're required to permeate water back down into the, to recharge the water table to some degree at a local level?
Yeah, we don't have to do that, but like our neighboring agency, City of Woodland and the Woodland Davis Clean Water Agency, they use what's called ASR, Aquifer Storage and Recovery. And in years of surplus, they inject surface water into the ground to help boost the groundwater table. And in years of deficit, they remove water out. So that is something that's on sort of the planning, feasibility planning level right now at the city. And it could be that, or it could be just just wells that extract water. There's obviously a significant cost differential, so that's part of the question.
Thank you. That was helpful. I didn't know about that, that there was a groundwater sustainability agency. So that's interesting. Thank you.
Commissioner Blondo?
Thank you. Just as a question for the study and in relation to other studies you may have done for other cities and areas. And as we, I think Commissioner Solorio and I toured the George Christoph Water Facility, and they noted to us that there was definitely a reduction in city consumption when the meters started going. Is it in general that when the meters are in and we're charging for water that the demand would go down?
Absolutely. We see that continually or almost everywhere in the state of California. When meters go in and people start getting charged on a volumetric basis, and they're seeing sort of how their water use ties to the amount they pay, that water use goes down. So the city, I think, was fully metered. I want to say 2018 or 2019. I can't quite remember, but we're starting to see more of that now. Greg wants to speak up on this, I can tell already. So yes is the answer. And Greg, maybe you want to add to
that. Yeah, just a quick add. Everything Gilmore said is spot on. The city still has a few connections that are unmetered and is continuing to work on that. A lot of those are some of the kind of prior rural residential areas in the south part of the city. The installation of a meter and then a volumetric rate definitely has a drive to reduce use. But you also see ongoing reduction due to the appliances and the fixtures and just a conservation ethic that is continuing to grow. And so that is part of the reason why demands have dropped and the city was able to meet its GPCD, gallon per capita per day target that was set forth in its 2015 plan. So it wasn't all just driven from meter activities. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Since there's an opportunity to comment on that, and this is very timely because I mentioned this to Paulina before. As I looked at my own bill, my own water bill, I noticed it was per whole volumes of for CCF, centicubic feet, which is an abstract form converted to 748 gallons per CCF. I actually raised this to the city in a public comment that says, when I look at my bill, it's in whole numbers of CCF, so I only consume in increments of 748 gallons. So the question I had was, well, if I consumed 749 gallons, would it then report to me that I consumed double? In which case, if I am trying to moderate my consumption, and you had one of these demand management calls that says reduce water by 15%, in some cases that is not possible, or I'll have to overshoot that to get the 15% data. Is there a plan to address the meter issues in terms of its accuracy, greater accuracy?
Let me start with that, Greg, and then you can jump in on that too. So absolutely. I think part of this in terms of the planning and looking at the meter data is understanding what they're gathering and how they're using it and what it's for, right? So now when you get to a shortage provision or shortage time, are you doing the right thing? And is what you're doing actually measurable? And does it matter on a large scale basis? I think that there are going to be provisions or will be provisions at the individual level, right? I mean, this is where it gets down to, is our meter data accurate enough to do what we need it to do? And maybe, Greg, you want to add a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, I know the city's meters are accurate. I think this is a question of what's getting reported versus what the meters are actually measuring and how that's rolling up into the bills. And I'm not familiar with the details of the city's billing system on that front, but the meters are accurate. And I know the city is also continuing to invest in what they call AMI, which are essentially automatic meter reads, which can even get to the place where you can have a feedback as a customer, kind of like a PG&E smart meter. You could see what your even diurnal uses can be to understand what might be driving some of your own use. So those tools are continuing to evolve, and the city is continuing to work down that path. But the equipment that's in the ground should be very accurate. and is part of a ongoing maintenance program to make sure they retain accuracy.
Right. And just my feedback on that one, when I commented in the city about the meters, they replaced it with a digital meter that's more accurate, that provides fractions of the CCF. So now I could calculate it with their equivalent 748 per 1 unit. Previously, what I had in my water bill and what I could have seen in the meter they had was not sufficient. And I raised that to the city council, not just for me. So it was odd that the behavior was to replace my meter specifically. I mentioned it as a systemic issue because I've asked several other people I know who live in the city who says, what does your bill say? And a lot of them are in that whole CCF increments, and so a few are in the fractions. So I could tell you that as I moderate my consumption to try to conserve, because it is a drought, it is hard to do if it's full, non-fraction calculation, and even to the point of this reporting by CCF. So if the city does report it by exact gallons, that would be great. And the bill is actually confusing because it reports a gallon consumption when that is not accurate. It's not accurate to the details. Because as I mentioned, if I looked at it historically and I added up all my bills the last 2.5 years, it is that 748 gallon increments. And it's always divisible by 748. So I double it, triple it, quadruple it, but it's always in the 748 gallon increments. So some months it looks like I consumed the exact same amount as I did the previous month, or the previous year. So it's kind of odd. It's like, how can I do that? So that was where I started doing the investigation. So it's something I would suggest if the city can move towards that and provide that information, at least in the interim, that says, here's how do you read your bill, and here's why you can't get to the detailed per gallon.
Okay, point taken.
Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Chelina?
Sorry, I was trying to raise my hand. Just curious, so, the city's target of gallons per capita per day is sort of lumping in both commercial, indoor residential use, outdoor use. I'm just curious how the water plan takes into account I believe it was, I'm gonna have to remember bill numbers here, but AB 1666 and SB 606 from 2018, the Making Conservation a Way of Life, which I know had kind of 4 different buckets that water utilities are supposed to try to reduce consumption in to hit certain targets. And then there was discussion this year in the legislature of potentially lowering the indoor residential water use standard, since many residential places around the state were already meeting the targets that were set in 2018. But that bill, I believe, is on hold until next year. But just curious how some of that usage gets unpacked among the different sectors in the city.
You've opened up a slight can of worms here, but I'm going to give this to Greg Young. This is his favorite thing of all. Please go, Greg.
Well, maybe not favorite thing of all, but definitely great questions, Commissioner. The way to best look at this is the per capita number that is put forward for the 2020 to demonstrate compliance is now kind of water under the bridge, so to speak. So that was a blended number, total population, total usage, and you had set a target, and the city has met and exceeded that target. Now going forward, all the new legislation has established what's called an urban water budget. And that budget does have these buckets of water associated with outdoor residential landscaping, commercial landscaping, and indoor residential use and losses. It doesn't necessarily pick up every component of use for any water supplier, but it's the major buckets. What we do is, in all the projections, and the reason why in that slide we had existing customers and then new customers, the existing, because often there isn't a lot of good breakdown with historic data, we simply are applying a generalized continuation of a small amount of conservation to be conservative from the flip side of not overly assuming too much reduction so that we don't end up with an estimated demand that never occurs, too low of a demand. We want to be realistic and be on the conservatively high side. But for all the new customers, when we look at and break down all of the potential growth, and there's chapters written about the land use, and all of that intersects with the city's recently adopted housing element, it has multifamily under several different configurations, from studio to 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, and then a couple of different designations of single family. And for those, there's presumed occupancy rates that vary. You know, your studio is generally going to have 1 person. Your single family might have an average 2.8 or 3. What we do in estimating those demands is we use those newer per capita values, like 55 gallons per person per day, multiplied by the occupancy times the number of expected connections associated with the growth plans, to generate what that new customer demand might be, and then apply all the landscape ordinance requirements. And then separately look at demands from all the non-residential sectors and build that up. So by doing that, what we're trying to do is anticipate the fact that those future buckets are going to be the driver, and try and anticipate the future growth and demand from that perspective, while still not taking it down to maybe 50 gallons per person or something else. We're keeping it at the 55 so that we don't underestimate future demand and give ourselves some optimistic sense of how our supplies are matching up. So I think the short answer, that was a long answer, but the short answer is we absolutely pay attention to what was in those assembly bills and how that's all moving forward, so that we can look at positioning the city in the best place to meet all those requirements going forward.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Solorio.
Thank you. So my question is really curiosity. I'd like to hear just a little bit more, maybe just a quick summary of the North Delta Water Agency contract that is kind of a rare thing, you say, and I imagine, you know, quite a huge benefit for us. Can you tell us kind of summary of the history, kind of what's the term of that contract? Is it in perpetuity? Is it 20-year, 100-year? I'm curious.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. So it is very unique in the state of California. The North Delta Water Agency contract is a product of the old peripheral canal negotiations in the 70s. So when they were first talking about bypassing the Delta and doing some of the other things they're still talking about today, some very smart people in the North Delta Water Agency area, and a former colleague of mine who has since passed away, but a great man, negotiated this contract, which essentially says the state of California must use its water supplies that it captures under its water right and deliver water supplies to entities that have land in the North Delta Water Agency service area. And the way that manifests is on every single person's tax bill that lives within the North Delta Water Agency, there's a line item that says you pay $10 in tax to the North Delta Water Agency, and then the city essentially delivers the water on your behalf to your location. So it's a really unique item based in a historical negotiation. It has no expiration date. It's never really been tested, meaning there are probably still some questions out there about, you know, what all the water supplies will mean in the future in the changing conditions that we're seeing around us, both hydrologic conditions and regulatory conditions. But in terms of security, it's probably the best you're going to get. And that's an important thing.
Yeah, that did sound very rare when you said it. I was surprised that this region has that, and what a huge benefit.
Yeah.
You know,
unbelievable benefit.
Beneficiaries we are. I did have an opportunity to kind of zone out on a documentary a few years ago about the history of water in the state, and I have a little bit of context for what you're talking about. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Any other questions? No? Great. Well, thank you very much. Very great presentation. Appreciate it and look forward to seeing the finalized report. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so that moves us out of our regular agenda to our general administration function, part 2. So our next Environment Utilities Commission regular meeting, will be on December 13th, 2021. But it sounds like we might have a special meeting. Ben, did everyone confirm on that one? On the date?
Yes, we did. We will be having that meeting November 8th.
Okay, so we will have a special meeting on November 8th. Okay, and then that goes to reports from city staff.
Thank you, Chair Cordano. I wanted to get back to you. At the last meeting, you had asked for an update on the owl boxes. I have to apologize. I haven't been able to get any good data back from the employee who manages that contract, but I do know that Perry's Wildlife Service, who installed those boxes and maintains them, is still under contract with the city. So I'm still working to find out if they're being utilized and how effective they are. Unfortunately, I was out for a month, medical stuff, and that person's retiring and he was out. So the timing was bad, but I will try to get some information back to you before the end of the year. And I know that we had also attempted to schedule some tours for the commissioners to different facilities. So if you are still interested in the landfill, the Yolo County landfill facilities, email me your general availability so I can talk to the landfill staff person. Because I know, it's difficult given the tours have to happen during normal work hours. So you can just give me a general idea individually of what works for you, like, never on Mondays, maybe on a Tuesday at 2. I mean, that kind of thing, that would be helpful. And I can to find options there. And yes, the November 8th special meeting will happen. We needed to add that meeting due to some time-sensitive changes in this book code related to the urban water management. So that's what we're doing there. And last, on the implementation plan for SB 1383, while that plan won't come back to the commissioners, at this point we have your feedback and we'll incorporate into what we take to the council. I will update you in December on what happened and let you know, just in a verbal update like I do during this portion of the meeting. That's all I have.
I have a quick comment. So I appreciate you trying to schedule the tours, and it was probably very difficult to try to coordinate everybody's schedule. And then we had the item around whether or not it's a quorum. And so I guess, so the way I should think about tours in the future, it would be mostly just individual or just a couple of people at a time, right? Unless we put it as an official agenda item.
Correct.
And then would that mean that members of the public would be like joining us on the tours, or just that they need to know about it?
Well, potentially. I mean, that it becomes a public meeting when we have really reach a quorum commissioners in one place. So that we have to post it as a public meeting. So technically, I suppose they could join you on the tour. So that is just, it's not impossible to do that. And I wouldn't think that, like at the landfill, if we posted that 4 commissioners were doing a landfill tour at 2 o'clock on November 2nd, whatever. I don't think people are going to show up and try to be there with you, but it's just we have to do that. We would have to post. So it's just easier for everyone if we keep to 3, so we don't have to post on this public meeting. I know that got kind of challenging too. So.
Yeah, I felt kind of bad because I was seeing you try to coordinate so many people, and but I do appreciate that effort.
I have to say I did appreciate the water treatment plant tour. Very interesting, and learned a lot. And I think the folks there, Commissioner Solario, remind me, but I think we ran into some other folks that offered other tours of other aspects of the city utilities. I forget.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Probably, we could request other tours for other facilities that we're interested in. Run those through, Paulina's office and the clerk. I do have one other one that I really wanted to do was the port. So I'll send an email. But yeah, very friendly and knowledgeable staff. It was well worth the time. The transfer station, much more odorous. So I'll probably pass on the landfill after my experience at the transfer station, but still very eye-opening. Yeah, I'm glad I went. Thank you for all those efforts, coordinating efforts.
All right. Any other questions for Paulina? All right. So, does anybody have any future agenda items that they would like to request?
Well, I was going to request something about the water, but I think that was discussed right now, so it's no longer needed.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And it's 7:40. We're going to adjourn our meeting. So have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Chair.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Recording.